Okay, well, welcome everybody to my session titled Agronomy at a High Resolution. My name is Wes Anderson. I work for Croptimistic Technology and CropPro Consulting based in Beaumont, Alberta. Today I'm going to talk about, I guess, different layers of data, base data, and how we're looking to use it and share a few results, I guess, that things that we've been looking at and ways that we can prove that some of these methods of precision agriculture can in fact provide an ROI at the farm level. So first of all, I guess, what do I mean by agronomy at a high resolution? And to me, it's simply three steps. And first one, you got to recognize that response to inputs, all inputs, usually varies across a landscape. And not just from field to field. You need to map, measure, and manage that variability using the correct data layer that ideally delineates areas of similar response characteristics to whatever input we're talking about. And we might be talking about nutrients, we might be talking about seed, we might be talking about fungicide or lime, or even a herbicide. And then once you have all that information, you can just simply apply agronomy, and you're just simply applying it at a higher resolution than maybe before, whether that was within a field boundary or even just across all one crop across a farm. And you can liken it to TV resolution, in fact, where treating all the wheat in your farm, for example, would be like a 720p resolution screen. Managing it field specifically might be more like a 1080p. And now we're talking about ultra high def 4K, where we're looking at differences within a field even and across the landscape. So first of all, for soil applied inputs, our belief, our base layer that we utilize is what we call a SWAT map, a soil, water, and topography map. And I spoke at last year's conference about the specifics of a SWAT map and what goes in to make it. But essentially, it's a map that can encompass multiple layers of data, soil, water, and topography. So usually we're using an electrical connectivity data layer connected from a SWAT box, combined with either topography or elevation or water flow and accumulation layers. Okay, we can also loop in things like bare soil imagery and stuff as well, but the most common combination in the Western Canadian landscape would be an EC and topography combination, and maybe with water flow and accumulation layers as well. So the best way to think about it really would be in the context of water, where zone 1, or the red zones that you see in the bottom map here, would be the driest parts of the field, and that might be related to landscape position or soil texture. And the dark green zone 10 areas would be the wettest parts of the field, or if there's salinity in the landscape, those would be the most saline. So I'll leave it at that. We're looking at two different layers of data here that are very different. We're looking at a longer term average NDVI layer that shows poor areas that are brown and high biomass areas in dark blue. And actually you can see that there's a relationship with that with the SWAT map. But in this particular field, there's areas that are poor for very different reasons. So the zone 1 red area in the SWAT map, for instance, generally those areas are quite poor NDVI, poor bio. They did yield very poorly, but it's because the soil is acidic, very sandy, low water holding potential. Whereas the dark green zones in the SWAT map were also poor, but it's because they're saline and actually slightly sodic with high sodium. There's also an area in the sort of the top left corner there that's actually a reclaimed gravel pit. So again, we have something else that's a totally different artifact. It's not really reflected in the SWAT map, but we can use other layers of data on top of that to understand things that are going on in that area as well, and perhaps do some separate measurements if it's worthwhile. So here's just an example that field again with some soil test results. So you can see this is a very interesting field because almost every soil and nutrient property varies across this landscape and varies quite dramatically. It's not a huge field, 280 acres or so, I think. But you can see in almost every property, organic matter, pH, EC, most of the nutrient values vary quite significantly. And I've outlined in blue some things that really I feel in each individual zone are what I would call the yield limiting factors. And in zone 1, for instance, I circled the texture because frankly, there's just only so much water holding potential in that part of the field, right? So it's, in a lot of years, it's probably just simply water limited. But I think there's some things we can do from a nutrition perspective to also improve its water use efficiency, okay? And we can work to correct those as well. As we get into those lower zones, again, lots of nutrients, but it's limited by salts and high sodium that restricts root growth. And frankly, those parts of the field will never be good. But the point of this is I guess we need to be successful and provide an ROI at the farm level. We need to really understand what the limiting factors are. We don't need to understand that it's poor. We need to understand why it's poor. And that's where the SWAT map data layer comes in useful and separates some of those poor areas out from each other, or even frankly, just average areas, because in a lot of our landscapes, we can lose yield from having a little bit too much water, a little bit short of water, a little bit dry, maybe a little bit high in salts, or maybe a bit limited in some nutrient like phosphorus, right? So they might all yield the same, but for very different reasons. And the trick is to separate and delineate all those areas out from each other. So just a little practical purpose, we have now a precision ag research site at Nacum, Saskatchewan, so sort of east central Saskatchewan, black gray wooded transition soil zone. Yeah, this site was interesting. We had canola this past year and did a bunch of strips. I was hoping to be able to share a whole bunch of yield data from this site, but it's proven harder to extract good data out of the yield data than we maybe anticipated. But just to share one thing, we had a 0 sulfur strip, and the soil tested quite low in sulfur. I'll share those results in a second. But basically, in zones 1 and 2, okay, so which in this case in this field was kind of the top of the hills more or less, there was anywhere from a 5 to 12 bushel an acre response to applied sulfur. Whereas in some of those lower zones, zone 7, really 7 through 10, there was essentially no response to sulfur. And I guess the question is why? So to dive into this a little further, we see the soil test results, sulfur levels in pounds per acre to 12 inches. And yeah, there can sometimes be a lot more sulfur at depth, but 0 to 12 inches usually gives us a pretty good idea of what's there. And we also see the soil profile actually down to, I forget just what depth this is. I think it's at least 2 or 3 feet in these pictures here in 3 different zones. And you can see the organic matter depth in particular generally increases as we go really down slope. Zone 10 in this field is a depression area, very wet, actually rarely the highest yielding part of the field because it's just often too wet. It's collecting water. And along with the water, it's collecting solutes that are in the water. And that it often contains sulfate. So it's non-saline, but we see these nutrients like sulfur collecting in those lower landscape positions. Now, there was almost a perfect gradient in visual sulfur deficiency symptoms through the SWAT zones, where zone 1, the visual symptoms were severe. In the picture on the left there, you can see, even in this picture, they're very, very stereotypical sulfur, cupping, intervenal chlorosis, something you definitely do not want to see. We were actually surprised the yield results didn't have a wider spread than they did. But what's fascinating is you get these parts of the field that even in zone 7 and 8, that tested quite low in sulfur, only about 25 pounds of sulfate in 0 to 12 inches. Yet there was really literally no response. And I guess the question is why? And our comment would be that, sorry, I'll just go back a slide. Our comment would be that responsiveness to nutrients is determined by more than just soil test values. The nutrient parts per million or pounds per acre is just only one measurement. And understanding all the differences in the landscape, like mineralization potential, that is affected by both organic matter and relative water gradient, are also important factors. And that's where the power of a layer like SWAT maps comes in, because it accounts for really all those things. And the nutrient measurements from the soil lab are only one part of it. Here was another trial. Micronutrients are often very tricky to get responses to, right, and difficult to measure. And we had a series of trials. Again, I only really have gone through the data and done statistics on one of them, but we had a granular zinc trial in a wheat field in central Saskatchewan, very high pH soil, quite low zinc values. The soil test zinc DTPA was only about 0.3 and 0.4 ppm in much of this field. And that was primarily in those upper SWAT zones. So in a lot of cases in this area, we're dealing with eroded high pH knolls. And basically we did just flat rate, averaging about, it was, I think, 6.8 pounds per acre of a 20% granular zinc product. And we did VR. So it was really just an on-off. So we put 10 pounds of product or 2 pounds of actual zinc in some zones and none at all in the lower zones. And it just proved exactly what we sort of think we are doing with variable rate tech, right? And getting a better response and better ROI by applying those nutrients where it's actually responsive and not applying any where it's not responsive. Seed is also a soil applied input that we don't necessarily always talk enough about. And I think in parts of the US Midwest and even Ontario, they do talk a lot about varying corn populations and even soybean populations. As part of our service, we regularly vary seed rates. And this is a good example of why. This is a field from the Ag in Motion Discovery Farm just east or west of Saskatoon. And it was wheat this past year in this particular field. And these are the plant stands resulting from a variable rate prescription. So we actually increased the rates a little bit in zones 1 and 2, and we increased the rates quite dramatically in 8 through 10, because the actual mortality, when I'd worked the math backwards, the actual mortality rates are below. And we see this trend in so many fields, so many landscapes in Western Canada, where the mortality goes up a little bit on zone 1 and 2 because it's usually dry, often sandier soil, that sort of thing, maybe an eroded knoll. And we don't necessarily want more plants there, but we want to at least be at a minimum and prevent these bare knolls from producing next to nothing. As we get down into these lower zones, this field has some salinity in zones 8 through 10 in particular. And in this case, heavy kochia populations. We want to get, again, a certain minimum number of plants to at least compete with weeds, which was the main issue in those particular zones. But because of the salts, the mortality rates actually spiked up as high as 36% in zones 9 and 10 there. Whereas in zones 5 and 6, those nice sort of mid-slope areas where there's no real major issues, the mortality is only 10%. And this was direct seeded with a Seed Hawk air drill. Switching gears a little bit to some in-crop, here's where we actually look at using current imagery. So in this case, in this example, we've used NDVI, very commonly available, very cheap, easy to access now at fairly high resolution, 10-meter resolution. And I've got the SWAT map for this particular field, which is in northwestern Alberta. Very wet season in this past year, a lot of flooded out crop. You can see the NDVI image is quite highly correlated to the SWAT map, because in this case, all those lower zones, primarily zones 6 through 10, essentially flooded out, and that this was canola. So this was a very common scenario, and we utilized this technology quite a bit this year in that area, because frankly, it just made spraying fungicide a lot easier. There was some good canola on the tops of the hills. And in fact, most fields would have had the highest yield in zone 1, and there was really no yield at all in zone 7 through 10. So, in the absence of an image, we probably could actually use the SWAT map to produce a pretty good prescription as well, which in this case is just simply an on-off prescription. It's either 0 or 12 gallons an acre in this case for this farm. but we did manage to get a current image that reflected the current variability in that crop right at the beginning of July, and it worked really well. So obviously, when you sort of see that out as applied map, it would be pretty tough to manage the on-off manually by flicking switches in the sprayer. So the prescription makes it a lot easier. And by writing the prescription that way is just simply an on-off. We can also take advantage of the zonal control in the sprayer that'll just shut off sections at a time. Okay, switching again to something a little differently, again, still in crop, but a different purpose. So again, looking at another different data layer, and this is something that's in the research and development phase still within Croptimistic, and what we're calling a SWAT cam. So this is relatively affordable technology that can be mounted on pretty much anything, and you'll see it on just a quad. We mapped, again, this was a field at the Ag in Motion Discovery Farm this past season that happened to be seeded to canola. And we mapped it with a quad quite early in the year. I think the canola was actually still even just cotyledon stage, but very high weed pressure, and the weed pressure was like largely kochia, but there was the usual suspects. But in those lower zones where there was some higher salts, kochia was definitely the main culprit. So you'll see the graph there, leaf area percent going up to 16% in the case of weeds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, it was a lot. There was kochia growing on top of kochia nearly. And how we're getting the difference between crop and leaf area and weed leaf area is through a machine learning algorithm that the University of Regina is working on. So we're working with them in this project. Really simple technology, or the hardware is simple enough. The complex part is that machine learning behind the scenes to tell the difference between weed and crop, because that's one of the downfalls of NDVI imagery, is really it isn't capable of telling the difference between weeds and crop. It just sees green and it just sees biomass. I learned this past year that cattails, for instance, are very high NDVI early in the season. So how we're looking at utilizing this technology would be essentially mapping weed patches and weed density, and really actually doing an assessment of even crop density to ensure that we're getting proper crop densities across the field. And if we aren't, maybe we can go back and understand why and do a little more investigation. I would picture this technology being installed on sprayer booms going forward. So that really, as the sprayer's making a pass over the field earlier in the spring, it's just simply taking pictures every so often and providing this data to be able to use maps later on, because weed patches just don't go away overnight. If you've got kochia or wild oat patches, they're going to be there for usually a few years. So we could maybe take this map and then apply it as an edge application or an Avidex application later that fall, or perhaps the next spring or something, depending on what crop was to be seeded. That would be one way of utilizing it. In this exact field at the Ag in Motion farm, we actually utilized it right away because we mapped it with the quad. The field still needed to be sprayed with Liberty. In this case, it was in Vigor canola. And we produced a very simple prescription, really great way of using it, and just applied. Essentially, they mixed up a batch where at 10 gallons an acre, they would be applying the standard rate of Liberty at 1.35 liters an acre. But any agronomist would walk into the field and go to those heavy weed population areas and go, well, that's not going to cut it. I'd like to see, the high rate, 1.6 liters, and ideally even more water to get better coverage in the case of Liberty. And that's exactly what we could do. So it was just simply a prescription that varied from 10 to 12 gallons an acre, and varying the rate within label guidelines from 1.35 to 1.62 liters an acre. And they actually ended up applying the same prescription twice. So it was the same thing, applied it twice, and got actually really good control of the kochia. Switching gain also in crop, something else we're looking at developing, again, still sort of in pseudo R&D phase, but we're pretty well ready to go to market with this in the coming year, in a small way at least anyway, and SWAT water maps. And what these are utilizing is as the SWAT map is a base layer, but ideally getting additional information to go into it that includes soil texture, ideally at multiple depths, and organic matter. And all this information goes into a model that really predicts relative water holding capacity. And if you have a moisture probe in the field, actual available water real time throughout the season. So these are two examples actually from our NACM research site this past year, where they started off fairly wet. So that map on the left is from June 15th, and things were looking fairly good there. Again, you can tell that there's certain parts of the field that are always going to be drier, largely due to landscape position in this particular field. But actually, the subsoil texture is definitely sandier as well at depth. And the one on the right, towards the end of the season, in August 15th, in this case, things really started to dry out. In fact, really at the end of July, it was pretty clear. I mean, the crop was running out of water and yield wasn't really maximized. So we can start to use something like this for top dressing or variable rate irrigation, of course, I think has a good opportunity once that technology sort of gets more widely adopted and the ability is there. This is a wheat field from, again, the Ag and Motion Discovery Farm, where we applied a top dressing prescription. It was just UAN, dribble banded in crop, and that was from real-time moisture data. So at that point in time in June, there were certain zones that really looked like they had very strong yield potential. They had a very good start to the season. So we really cranked on the nitrogen. As it turned out, I think it looks like we probably could have even pushed zones 5 and 6 even harder based on this fall soil samples. But at the end of the day, we made a good, better informed decision, real time in season, to maximize yield and protein in that crop. And it's again using the proper data layer to help us predict yield in different areas of the field. So that's about all I had actually, and nearly used up my time slot, but would certainly be able to answer questions. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but hopefully it will create some thought and questions.
All right, thanks a lot, Wes. We do have a couple questions that came in, so we'll jump into a quick Q&A session. First question is from Lena from EOS Data Analytics. She says, Wes, thank you for your presentation. What is the source of water in SWAT map? Is it taken from sensors?
So the source of the water layer in the SWAT map, I'm thinking is what the question is. Really, that's just, so we're mapping elevation layer by usually RTK elevation, so very, very accurate elevation if we're physically driving and mapping the field, or we can get LiDAR in some areas as well. So again, very accurate elevation layer, vertical elevation. So yeah, and then we use a program that creates water flow paths and water accumulation areas and stuff. So those we would sometimes utilize that layer to impact the final SWAT map, I guess.
All right, next question, Nicole from Omafra. What was the cost savings on this fungicide trial?
Oh, yeah, actually, I was gonna, so the average, so typically they would have had they blanket applied, I suppose, which I don't think. I mean, there are some big areas where they would have switched off the sprayer manually, so it's hard to say exactly what they would have averaged if they had just sort of gone out without a prescription. But the average actually is only 7.3 gallons. In other words, 39% of the field was off. So, again, managed manually, hard to, we'd just be guessing, but you might be able to get what, 70% is good? I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, the resolution of this is really high. It's, you know, when you've got 8-foot sections, boom sections shutting off individually and stuff, it can be managed very, very accurately. And actually, when this farmer just got into it, he texted me and said, "These maps are just awesome." I mean, it takes away so much stress, which I guess, again, could you put some value on sort of the stress and fatigue of the operator too? Probably. It's hard to quantify though, I suppose.
All right, next question, also from Nicole at OMAFRA. Was there any nervousness by the operator that the approach was too site specific? Any desire to buffer the on region somewhere?
I don't think so. No. I think it's always a little nervous for them when they first get in the implement, whether that's a air seeder, fertilizer applicator, sprayer, whatever, that things will turn on and off at the proper time and everything. But as a company, we've been at this a long time, and we have very specialized people that really understand this stuff, and we know how to write prescriptions. So credit to them. I get no credit for that. But yeah, they had ground truthed all this themselves. So like any data layer, it always needs to be ground truthed and understood. So we simply provided them a 10-zone NDVI map, and they went out themselves with the app, with the crop records app in this case, and walked into the field and could see where they were relative to the map, and said, yeah, this zone we can shut it off, but this zone and above we would want a fungicide. So it was their call in the end where they decided to apply it. And then, yeah, I think provided how to write prescriptions and you understand the equipment that it's going to, that all just takes care of itself.
All right, great. One last question that came through from Ross of University of Saskatchewan. Any prediction on how long before the SWAT cam may be ready to go in the fields?
We're going to be this spring a pseudo commercial launch, I think. So we're gonna get it installed on several sprayers and several different farms would be the plan, and really put it to the test. Sometimes some of this equipment might be fine in a quad, and then you get it at a sprayer going 18 miles an hour, and it's a bit of a different story. So it's there's going to be a little more testing, but provided everything goes well, yeah, it would be full launch for, I suppose, 2022 season.
A couple more questions are coming in here. Brian from A Business and Crop, he says, do you use SWAT maps for variable rate nitrogen split?
Uh-oh, I think we lost you.
Hey, Wes, one more question. I'm not sure if you got that.
No, I didn't.
Brian is asking, do you use SWAT maps for variable rate nitrogen, split nitrogen?
Yeah, so for, like, in most cases we're using it definitely at seeding time and all fertilizer going down into the soil at that point. For top dressing, it depends, and we might use a bit of a hybrid of NDVI and SWAT maps, or just use the SWAT layer, or I've had situations where I've actually used an NDVI layer because maybe part of the field that had manure or something. So it just depends. It depends which data layer really fits the situation the best, I think. And that's, yeah, that's all I can really say, I suppose. But usually the SWAT map really is the layer that determines nutrient responsiveness and sort of yield prediction about the best. So we would in most cases use that.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks, Wes. We'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for sharing your different solutions that you have for farmers and showing some examples in action. It was great having you here today. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.